All right, we're back for another deep dive, and this time we're heading to a place that's pretty much the opposite of where we usually record.
Yeah, no kidding. Trading in the recording studio for, well, the most extreme environments on Earth.
Exactly. You guys sent in some absolutely incredible footage from a nature documentary all about climate change in the polar regions.
And what's cool is you specifically mentioned wanting to go beyond the doom and gloom. You wanted to know what's really going on down there, the good, the bad, and the truly awe-inspiring.
And let me tell you, this documentary does not disappoint. Visually, it's breathtaking. But there's also this underlying, almost a sense of urgency. Like, the beauty of it all is kind of overshadowed by this, well, this feeling that it's all very fragile.
Yeah, it's like the filmmakers knew exactly what they were doing. They used that beauty to suck you in and then, dot bam, hit you with the reality of how vulnerable these ecosystems really are.
Totally. It's like you've got these vast, pristine landscapes, penguins thriving in what seems like an impossible environment. And then you start to notice the little things. Like the documentary highlights Gentoo penguins, which are doing really well in Antarctica right now. But then it shows how dependent they are on these rocky areas for nesting.
And those areas are shrinking, right, as temperatures rise.
Yeah.
Less space, more competition. It's a recipe for, well, for some big challenges.
And it's not just about space, is it? It's about resources, too. Like, the documentary spends a surprising amount of time on krill, which at first I was like, okay, interesting choice.
Right, not exactly the most charismatic creature, at least compared to, say, a polar bear.
Exactly. But the more you watch, the more you realize these tiny creatures are the foundation of this whole ecosystem.
Totally. It's like a giant cascade, right? Disrupt the flow at the top, and it has ripple effects all the way down.
So you're saying what happens to the krill impacts, like everything, penguins, whales, the whole shebang?
100%. And here's the kicker. The documentary reveals that krill populations have been cut in half over the past 50 years. Warming waters, ice loss. It's a 1-2 punch.
Wow. And we see these incredible shots of like hundreds of humpback whales gathering to feed, knowing that their main food source is in trouble. It kind of changes how you see those whales.
For sure. It's that contrast that gets you. You're seeing this abundance of life, but then there's this underlying tension. Like, how long can this last?
Right. And speaking of interconnectedness, the documentary shifts gears a bit. It goes from the vastness of Antarctica to this much smaller island, Georgia del Sur. Why the sudden change of scenery? What makes this place so important?
That's where the filmmakers get really clever. See, Georgia del Sur, even though it's geographically separate, it's still tethered to what's happening in Antarctica. Specifically, the krill. It's like this lifeline stretching across the ocean.
Okay, so even though it's a totally different location, it's still dependent on the krill situation in Antarctica.
Got it. And the albatrosses are the perfect example. These birds, they fly thousands of miles to breed on Georgia del Sur, but their populations have plummeted like 40% decline. And guess why?
I'm guessing it has something to do with those shrinking krill populations we were just talking about.
Bingo. It all comes back to the krill. Unsustainable fishing practices further south, climate change impacting the krill. It all adds up.
Man, it really highlights how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? Like, what we do in one part of the world can have these huge consequences on ecosystems thousands of miles away. It's kind of scary how fragile everything is when you really think about it.
Yeah, and the documentary does not shy away from that. Like,
Yeah.
remember that scene with the leopard seal hunting those penguins?
Oh, man. Intense. I felt like I was right there watching it happen. Speaking of, the documentary doesn't just focus on Antarctica, does it? We also get a glimpse of the Arctic. Is it more the same? Just, on the other side of the world?
Well, the documentary makes a point of saying that the Arctic and Antarctica, while both polar regions, are actually very different. Antarctica is a continent covered in ice, while the Arctic is more like a frozen ocean surrounded by land.
Oh, right. I never thought about it like that. But the Arctic still has ice, which is still melting, right?
Absolutely, and it's happening even faster up there. The Arctic is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet, which is having a major impact on the sea ice, the stuff polar bears depend on.
Speaking of polar bears, the documentary shows some pretty incredible footage of them hunting seals out on the ice.
It's amazing footage, but what they don't show you is how much harder it's becoming for polar bears to hunt like that. As the ice melts earlier in the season and forms later, it disrupts their whole hunting rhythm. They have to travel farther, expend more energy, and it's just not sustainable in the long run.
It's kind of heartbreaking, honestly, to think of these incredible animals struggling to survive because their hunting grounds are literally disappearing.
And it's not just the polar bears feeling the heat. Remember those scenes with the walruses all huddled together on that tiny bit of land?
Oh man, those scenes were tough to watch, especially when they were all trying to climb up that cliff. It was almost like they were desperate.
They were desperate. The documentary explained that because of the shrinking sea ice, walruses are being forced to come ashore in these massive numbers, which leads to overcrowding, competition for resources. It's a recipe for disaster.
Man, the filmmakers really know how to tug at your heartstrings, don't they? But it's not just about the animals, is it?
Not at all. The documentary does a good job of connecting those heart-wrenching scenes back to the bigger picture.
Like how melting ice affects the entire planet.
Exactly. They talk about how the polar ice acts like a giant mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space, which helps keep the Earth cool.
It's like Earth's natural air conditioner, right? And we're messing with the thermostat.
Pretty much. Less ice means less reflection, which leads to a warmer planet. And a warmer planet means more melting ice, which, well, you see where this is going.
A vicious cycle. And one we can't seem to break out of. So what's the solution? Can these animals adapt fast enough to survive what's coming? I mean, the documentary did show some pretty incredible examples of resilience. Yeah, they're tough cookies, that's for sure. But you gotta wonder, how much can they really adapt? I mean, the planet's changing faster than ever.
Right. It's like they're incredibly resilient, these animals, but there's got to be a limit, right? And the speed at which things are changing, that's the real wild card. It's like watching evolution and fast forward, but it's a nail biter, that's for sure.
Makes you realize that, like, what happens at the poles doesn't just stay there, you know? It's all connected. It's like you said, what happens there affects us all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not just about the ice melting and the sea levels rising. We're talking about potential disruptions to ocean currents, changes in weather patterns. It's a whole domino effect that could impact human populations far beyond the Arctic Circle. And that's what the documentary does so well. It reminds us that it's all connected.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to wrap your head around. And one thing that struck me was how much we still don't know. Like, the documentary focuses on the usual suspects, polar bears, penguins, but there's a whole world of life down there that we rarely see.
Oh, absolutely. We tend to focus on the big, charismatic animals, but what about all the other creatures? The microscopic algae, the krill, all those species we're only just beginning to understand. They play a crucial role too.
Yeah.
And how they respond to climate change could have huge ripple effects.
It's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and it's melting faster than we can study it.
That's a great way to put it.
So where do we go from here? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. Like, what can we even do?
I get it. It's a lot. But I think the documentary does a good job of reminding us that even though the situation is serious, it's not hopeless.
Okay, so there's hope.
For sure. And a lot of it comes down to knowledge. The more we understand these ecosystems, the better equipped we'll be to protect them.
So it's not just about doom and gloom. It's about understanding the problem so we can find solutions.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those connections, those ripple effects, and making smarter choices, both individually and as a global community.
It's like we're all in this together, right? The fate of the polar regions, the planet, it's interconnected with our own. Well, that was quite the journey. From penguins and polar bears to melting ice and the delicate balance of our planet. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And remember, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.